good afternoon. I'm very happy and grateful for the invitation to reflect together with you around the question of what it means to work as a historian with photographs, and in particular, what ways photography changes or has an impact on what we as historians are doing. So as the last to present, I become kind of a discussant. I mean, Karin, no worries. I don't aspire for your job, but I mean, quite a number of topics that came up during the day. You will recognize them in what I'm presenting. So, for instance, social biography, agency of the photographs, etc., etc. So, but let me delve into the matter. So, what does it mean to work as a historian with and through photographs, and in what ways have photographs changed or impacted on our relationship with the past? So nowadays, it would be hard, if not impossible, to find historians who would not accept. You can change to number 3, Elena.
Yes, just a second.
So
Yes.
exactly.
No.
So it's impossible nowadays to find historians who would not accept photographs as sources for their work on an equal footing with, say, written documents or any kind of oral traditions. One would think that this is self-evident, considering that let's call it the invention of photography dates back almost 200 years, and also the beginning of modern historical scholarship goes back to about 200 years, to the first half of the 19th century, and the German scholar Leopold von Ranke as one of the leading figures of historism. So, and this means that both history as a science and photography as a technical documentation medium, they have a history of almost 200 years. However, there was no common history until well into the 20th century. And this is all more astonishing as both von Ranke's famous, so frequently quoted sentence from the preface of his first book, that he only wants to say, wie es eigentlich gewesen, how it actually was, as well as Wilhelm von Humboldt's statement, an important source for von Ranke's thinking in his famous treatise on the task of the historian, that, and here you have the quote, one has scarcely arrived at the skeleton of an event by a crude sorting out of what actually happened. What is so achieved is the necessary basis of history, its raw material, but not history itself. And this resonates in major issues that accompanied photographs as sources ever since. Please, the next slide. So some of these issues are the tension between what photographs show and what they don't reveal immediately to the beholder's eyes, the promise of a direct access to the past that still must undergo, however, a process of critical forensics, but then also an invitation to go beyond the fact and event, as well as developing a sensibility to their affective dimension and an approach that encompasses more than visual patterns of thinking. I want us to go briefly back to the point of a common history of history and photography, and take a closer look at the question of how photography came into history. That is, how historians started to do history on, through, and with photographs. And I will thereby focus on African history, because this is where I feel most at ease, and it is also the most relevant for the raison d'être for this workshop. of today, the comparative history of women's professions in Africa. But much, of course, applies also to other contexts and continents. Please, the next slide. There were two principal lines of research interest. So what I do, I look a little bit back, just how this all happened, how this history and photography came together. So there were two principal lines of research interest developing more or less in parallel. One dealing with the history of photography in Africa, and the other one with photographs as sources for African history. They were not always clearly distinguishable from each other. So research on the history of photography in Africa was characterized by the discovery. Can you see my fingers?
Yes.
Because I can't see myself. So characterized by the discovery in the 1980s of the existence of African photographers and the question who they were, how and where they learned their profession, if there were women photographers, what the difference was between them and non-African photographers, what their contribution to the colonial photo archive was, etc. What was important then was that there was actually an African history of photography in Africa. The white South African author David Ben-Suzan mentioned, albeit in passing and incompletely, the existence of African photographers in his Silver Images from 1966 about the history of photography in Africa. Later, in the 1880s, we have Vera Vidis Wards, who wrote about early photographers in Sierra Leone, and that was in the 1983-4. And a growing body of research has since provided new insights about individual 19th and 20th century photographers, the way photography spread across the continent, and how photographs circulated as part of a wider visual economy, to use Deborah Poole's phrase, within and between various media and geographical spaces. I have written about this using the term the visual Atlantics. The second one, please, the next slide. Photographs as sources for African history was addressed as early as 1970 by the French historian Christian Fourlacroix, who, I cite, given the scarcity or absence of other sources of information, pointed to the importance of photographs for the writing of African history. 18 years later, the collected contributions to the symposium Photographs as Sources for African History, and the contributors to that symposium were, let me say, probably we could term them the first generation of people who worked on and with photographs in Africa and African photography. So Chris Geary, for instance, was one of the participants, and probably also, if I remember well, Elizabeth Edwards. So this represented a milestone that defined a new program for historical research. Also, it provided one of the first comprehensive overviews of the history of photography on the continent. It dealt much less with the question of sources, although the title was Photographs as Sources. Stephen Sprague's article, Yoruba Photography, very known, classics, How the Yorubas See Themselves from 1978, was not only chronologically in between the two events, Fourlacroix and the symposium, but also thematically not clearly to categorize, as it drew its energy from both of the above-mentioned lines of research. So history sources for African history, but also African photographers. And he was also the one who he addressed the question of agency in the relationship between photographer and photographed, which has become, as we have seen today, a standard question when working with and through photographs. So please, next slide, numbers, yes. So from the 1980s onwards, scholarly research on and with photographs gained momentum, and with this interest growing, that was also fueled by an increasing attention that the international art market paid. The international art market was extremely important in regard to the interest, scholarly interest in photographs, and in particular also of African photography. So more and more photos from Africa appeared. This was partly due to the fact that photo albums were now being brought to the light from cellars and attics, and photo studios and their archives on the African continent were receiving increasing attention and visits. On the other hand, the rapid development of the internet and digitization and electronic storage technology made further masses of photographs easily accessible on screens all over the globe. A veritable wave of digitization swept through large parts of the museums, ongoing, and archives of the global north, and to some degree also the global south. So the consequences for scholars interested in working with photographs from Africa were tremendous. Please, the next slide. So what were these consequences, and let's talk about the consequences first. Access and availability. A huge amount of previously unknown photos were now readily available on home screens to anyone in the world with a computer and a reasonable, powerful internet connection. Photo archives and collections could be searched and researched much more easily. The same applies to the growing number of digitized newspapers, such as 19th century newspapers from West Africa, which, with a keyword search, for instance, for photographer, yielded a vast amount of new information with relatively little effort. That was really, there was a kind of a revolution. Also, it became easy and every year cheaper to store huge amounts of data on one's computer, photographs, just ready available for working with. And then, of course, the communication and exchange with collectors, museums, and archives that kept photographs or were interested in photographs became much easier and faster, which created new networks. Then, what did this all mean for historians? Please, the next one, slide. So there was a new way of looking at how Africans were looking at themselves and the world they were living in. And through access to a variety of different sources, archives and collections, new connections between photographers, photographs, events, and ideas could be researched and explored. And naturally, this naturally led to a greater visibility of the great mobility of photographs on a global scale, and how this mobility was linked to the mobility of people and ideas. And here again, we are with Deborah Poole. And then new digital technologies, that is digital photography, the digitalization of large historical deposits of analog photography, and the digital storage of photographs led to in brackets, nostalgic turn towards the materiality of photographs and the information one gets from a three-dimensional object. So we were looking at photographs, we were turning the photograph, and of course, this is also linked to the social biography of the object. Then the next slide, please. I think it's still the same. No. Okay. So again, what does it mean for historians is the continuation. New digital technologies have also reorganized the way we organize archives, which has led to a greater focus on archives and the role they play in the creation and formulation of knowledge. There's been a still ongoing focus on archives, the agency of archives, et cetera, et cetera. As interest in the study of African photography and photography as a source for historiography in general grew, so did, I already mentioned it, so did interaction and exchange between scholars, creating a dynamic that was extremely fruitful to the entire field of African history. And the abundance of photographs and the access to large digitized archives, such as press photo archives, opened new possibilities and challenged to work with series of photographs. This has been mentioned also today, the work with series of photographs. So let me give you a brief example of how I have used these possibilities to work with a large number of photographs and photo series. I will show you just in a moment a couple of images. So the source was the Buea, which is the Anglophone part of Cameroon. Buea was the old German capital of Cameroon, the colony. So there's a press photo archives, and I had access to the digitized negatives and contact sheets of that archives and to the database, which covered the years between 1955 and the mid-1990s. And so I wanted to find out when, at which events, and with what regularity, which portraits of the political leaders were made visible in public space. For instance, at parades or in administrative buildings. And looking for units in a series, in one part of the research, I concentrated on portraits of the current president, Paul Biya, who is in power for 40 plus years and who succeeded Cameroon's first president after independence, Amadou Ahidjo, in November 1982. So after 1985, the year of the formation of Paul Biya's party, the CPDM, you know, the D in an African party is always democracy, and the M is always movement, and the P is always people. So, his large-sized portrait, taken and printed in Yaoundé, started to be paraded regularly during national and youth days. However, the first time his portrait appeared in the Anglophone part of Cameroon was during his maiden visit of the Southwest Province in April 1983, just a couple of months after he had taken over from Ahidjo. And it was the same portrait for many years that was paraded and put on display in administrative buildings. And so now let's go to the images.
Thanks.
Please. So this is the portal of the reception for the maiden visit, left and right, Paul Biya's portrait. He was born in 1933, so he's 91 years old, and in 83 he was, well, 40, 50? I'm bad in mathematics.
50.
60, already 60. Oh dear.
50.
50, okay, so he was 50 years old when he visited. I'm not sure if he was 50 years old when the photograph was taken. So that is one example. So the next one is from the same maiden visit. Same, you can change. So this same photograph presented by a group of women and men, because in the Southwest, men also wear skirts.
Mhm.
The next one. Next slide, please. So that is interesting because, I mean, what we see is a woman presenting a picture, we would say, but because it's part of a series, we know that it is not the picture, the photograph of her grandmother she's showing to Paul Biya, but it is his portrait she's showing. So that's one of the advantages working with series. The next one, please. Here again, presentation of the photograph. So the photograph apparently is part of the ritual. It was not the case for Ahijo. Ahijo didn't appear in such a way in the public. And so the next photograph is from a couple of months later. It's the election campaign. It's an election campaign, but still it's the same photograph. And the next one comes with some unintended humor. I mean, that's the nice thing with photographs. No? There's sometimes really nice photographs. So that's also from the election campaign. Next one, it's Paul Biya's portrait paraded at the Youth Day parade, and in later years. So you see it's 88, 99, etc. So it continues. So please, next slide. All this, one could argue, is already possible before the internet and before the digitization of archives and collections, etc. But this is only true to a limited extent, because in addition to the fact that searching and browsing the images in a digital archive could, of course, be done much faster and more precisely, there was now the added playfulness of placing them next to each other in a fast and quickly changeable form, shifting the focus and delving into details that could only be achieved in this form with a great deal of effort, and therefore tended to be omitted. And with this, let me turn to the second part and the question in what ways photographs have changed or impacted on our relationship with the past. Please, the next slide. Next slide. Next. Okay, stop. Thank you. So recently, when discussing photo archives in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the difficulties to get access and the poor conditions in which they were, etc., somebody asked me an interesting question, and also a simple question in a way. So she asked, would the history of the DRC have been written differently if the photographs from archive X or Y had been known or more accessible at the time when the history was written? And I said, yes, of course. Only thinking of the additional information value of photographs as sources, their quantitative value, so to speak. But then I remembered what Wilhelm von Humboldt wrote in The Task of the Historian, that there's more than just the fact. I mean, there's more than just the quantitative dimension of additional information or more photographs. There's also a qualitative dimension. And now this can go in various directions, but it took me to reflections about the, as I mentioned, the qualitative value of photographs and their value beyond the fact. So to the question what photographs do to history, or as the British anthropologist and historian Elizabeth Edwards wrote, how their presence as entities infiltrates our ideas of what it is to do history. So a new relationship between the practice of history and the fact that there is photography, that there are photographs, that we are living in a photographic time. Because after we have given this question some time to mature, we begin to see very clearly that indeed photographs have the potential to change our relationship with the past. And in fact, this has already happened without us even realizing it. How do they do this? So most obviously, photographs translate the past in new ways. Its mutations of time, space, or scale affect the core of the discipline's history, the discipline's representational practices. They entice us with direct access to the past and are particularly seductive for that sense, the visual sense, which has developed the most in the last century. We have become very, very visual people in the last century. So Roland Barthes, in Rhetoric of the Image from 1964, he wrote, so that the type of consciousness, can you please move on with the slide? Okay, I have to read it. I didn't, okay. So he said, Barthes said, the type of consciousness the photograph involves is indeed truly unprecedented, since it establishes not a consciousness of the being there of the thing, which any copy could provoke, but an awareness of its having been there. What we have is a new space-time category, spatial immediacy and temporal anteriority, the photograph being an illogical conjunction between the here now and the there then. And that is what makes photographs a disturbing thing. Because what has been appears present. Barthes mentions central characteristics of the disturbances provoked by photographs, namely space, time, and how they are bound together like Siamese twins. But another aspect is evoked here, which is how past and present are interconnected in a similar, indissoluble way, but unstable way. Ariella Azoulay, she has been cited already. She wrote, and also what she said about event. So I have something else to say about event, so I'm citing what she had to say about event. She said, the event of photography, and we have to add contrary to the photographed event. So we distinguish between what has been photographed and the fact that the event has been photographed. So the event of photography is never over. It can only be suspended, caught in the anticipation of the next encounter that will allow for its actualization. An encounter that might allow a certain spectator to remark on the excess or lack inscribed in the photography, so as to re-articulate every detail, including those that some believe to be fixed in place by the glossy emulsion of the photographs. Meaning that the photograph comes with, when it moves in time, it comes with a demand for a new reflection, a new questions. because the event is never over, and the event is in the present. The event is always in the present. In that way, and I cite Elizabeth Edwards, photographs allow the past to seep into the present in multiple ways that well up and leak through time and space, and disturbing this distance and the distancing techniques. Distancing techniques, she means that historians, they want to treat the object in an objective way, so they want to keep a distance to what they research, a kind of a detachment, an emotional detachment, which photographs ask for so much. As for the disturbances that photographs can cause in our appreciation of the time that makes up the past, historian Ulrich Baer has argued that only if we abandon or substantially revise the notion of history and time as inherently flowing and sequential, we will recognize that we see or fail to see in photographs. So we have to think time in a different way. So while photographs invite us to work and think in multiple temporalities, they allow us in an unprecedented way a vacillation between distance and closeness, between micro and macro levels. Please, the next slide. It's not only the granularity of the photo, that is the possibility of zooming into the image, and we had a wonderful example of zooming in when Marlene showed us the boy in the coconut plantation. So zooming in, and she could tell us so much details about what she saw. And somehow, I mean, I was very often tempted to work, and I actually did work with a magnifying glass when looking at photographs, even watching photographs. So zooming into the image to examine the details, otherwise hidden from the eye, but also the connection between what the photo shows on a micro level with what it announces beyond the frame and individual experience. So photographs play lightly with small details and large dimensions, sometimes in a way that makes them difficult to grasp. When we look at the photograph, perhaps holding it in our hands and turning it, we sometimes forget that the picture was taken on purpose by someone who thought what it showed was so important, so valuable, that he or she documented it and kept it for future remembrance. But the photographs, what is happening? Can you still hear me?
Yes, yeah, we are with you.
Okay, so, but the photographs always show more. It's indeed characterized by an excess of inscription, a wealth in details that offer an unintended but fruitful access to the past. However, the richness of detail is not just a question of additional information, but of ruptures and cracks that encourage you to think with and through. So it's an entry point. So let us quickly take a look at the following picture, which illustrates several aspects of what I just have said. So this is a photograph that is part of a small collection of a Cameroonian family. And what we see is something happening, a celebration of something. So when I did the research, I learned that it was taken in Bruyères. Bruyères is a small village in the east of France. It was October 1950, and the reason for the celebration is not very clear, but it might have been the visit of a delegation, of a high-ranking delegation from Cameroon in that small village. So on the one hand, what it shows is the possibility of this zooming in, because what you can see when you would zoom in, and hopefully you can even see it, is here in the middle. In the middle is a ram. Can you see that? There's a between the head on the right of the person in front, the blurred person. So you go to the middle of the line that is formed by the soldiers, and there's a ram. And the ram, do you see the ram? Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so the ram is the mascot of the North African Rifle, the North African Rifle Regiment. And so the interesting thing is that with regards to several temporalities and relational levels that intersect in this image. So on the one hand, we have, and we know, I mean, 1950s, the French colonial empire was slowly moving towards its end, towards its dissolution. But with the presentation of the North African Rifle Regiment and their ram, it is a reference to a grand French colonial past. So it's a reference to the past. At the same time, there is the power of the present event that is staged and performed, which also is a promise into the future, meaning that the French colonial empire will continue into the future. So there's several temporalities in this image. What is also in the image is the macro dimension. So there's this celebration happening in this village, but at the same time, it shows how this small village is part of a bigger dimension, a bigger world, which is the French colonial empire. So the power and the symbols, the rituals of this French colonial empire seep into the deep province, this village in eastern France, which, by the way, was also the theater of one of the biggest Second World War battles in the liberation of Europe. So there's well, that was some years ago. And actually, what happened during this battle, this liberation battle, a good part of the village was destroyed, and people from this village working in Cameroon provided the village with food, coffee, bananas, etc., etc. And so there is a connection between this village and Cameroon and Paris, because Paris agreed with renaming the Grand Rue, so the main artery of this village, to rename it Avenue Cameroon, Avenue du Cameroun. So it's probably the only village with such a name. So there's certainly more to say, but I suggest we leave it at it for here for that moment and come to a preliminary conclusion. So what I have presented is neither a methodology nor a theory, but some elements that invite us to think about and taking into consideration the potential of photographs for the work historians do for the practice of history. In a way, it's also an invitation to question, reflect on, and expand a number of fundamental assumptions from the historian's toolbox, such as the understanding of time, action, context, agency. The immediate accessibility of photographs appeals to our feelings and emotions more than any other historical source, and engaging with photographs in this way goes beyond purely visual thought patterns and is promising. So oscillating between different levels of time, between mass and uniqueness, between distance and proximity, the potential of photographs unfolds powerfully in the practice of history. And with this, I say thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, I think we have to stop now. And thank you very much for all this, for your speech, and to the people also who are here, present and virtually, to be here with us until 45 minutes late, I have to say. 55 minutes late at the end of the day. And thank to all the participants for this quality workshop that I really thoroughly enjoyed. And thanks to Karin and to Anne and to Domenico who helped me to put it up and to organize everything.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to everybody and all and the organizers.